Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are and when you are watching us. Thanks very much for joining us again. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us for what I think is going to be one of the really interesting sessions. Not that the other sessions weren't interesting, of course not. They were all very interesting. But today we've got a discussion which is perhaps slightly less directly connected to ATM technology, but completely related to ATM technology and completely on track, and the sort of background stuff that we all need to know. I think it's really important that we have this sort of conversation. If the measure of doing something well is to always talk to people who are smarter than you, I'm doing something very well this morning because I'm speaking to three people who are significantly smarter than me, and I'm really happy to be able to do that and to be able to talk this morning about the economics of ATM, the economics, which therefore, of course, means a conversation about the economics of aviation more generally, and then to see how that relates to what we do going forward. And so it's with enormous pleasure that I introduce our panel of this morning. We're joined by Brian Pearce, who is the Chief Economist of IATA. IATA, of course, the International Air Transport Association, the trade association that represents airlines, international airlines. We also have Adrian Harbart, who is the Director of the Central Route Charges Office and of Finance at Eurocontrol. Adrian is an economist by training, and is also, of course, very, very close to not so much, the economics of watching where the money flows. And of course, we have Florian Gillemet, who is the Executive Director of SESAR Joint Undertaking, again, for this conversation. So having introduced our panel, I think you'd agree with me, we're being spoken to, or we're having a conversation with people smarter than ourselves now. Brian, let me start with you. As I said in the introduction, I think you can't talk about ATM without talking about aviation more generally. Can you give us a quick sort of outline of what the situation's looking like for the airlines and therefore for the industry? And before I ask you to do that, do I need to ask you, should I be giving a trigger warning to the audience at this point?
No, not at all. Thanks, Andrew. Well, obviously, we had some good news yesterday, didn't we? With the Pfizer announcement of the vaccine. But to be frank, that doesn't change what our expectations are at the moment, and that is for a much smaller industry for at least several years. I can't see us returning to the normality that we had pre-crisis. COVID really hit in international aviation, and there hasn't been a recovery. We saw a catastrophic 98% fall in April, which grounded the industry. We know from the flight data that internationally we've really not seen very much of a recovery. The European travel bubble was helping. We did see some recovery in Europe in the summer months, but of course the big rise in the second wave of the virus has more or less completely reversed that. Bookings are down. I guess the one area of the aviation business that's still working fairly well is the cargo business, and that's supporting global supply chains. And it's obviously going to be critical in distributing a virus. But, let's not pretend the airlines have been hit by what is a catastrophic fall in revenues. Much of the industry would be bankrupt if it weren't for the government support that we have, which is keeping them on life support. I think the challenge at the moment is that, as airlines restart operations, the flights themselves are probably covering the costs of operations, but all of those overhead and fixed costs that airlines are bearing mean they're burning through cash. And, the industry is still highly vulnerable to failure over, the next 6 months to 12 months. It's it's still a very difficult situation, even with what we've heard from Pfizer yesterday.
So Brian, I remember a presentation you gave in September where you said the median airline has about 6 months cash left. None of that has changed, I assume. So all that's changed is we've come 3 months forward.
Well, a little bit has changed because the bigger airlines have been able to also access capital markets. They've been out raising debt. and also issuing equity, because they can't put prices up to recover, the revenues that they were expecting or the costs that they haven't been able to cover. They have either got to get cash from governments. Governments realise that this is a strategically important sector for the economy, which is why they have given aid to airlines and others in the sector. But other airlines have been able to raise cash from the capital market. So that has helped the larger airlines, but the median airline, the typical airline, has got about 8 or 9 months cash. So a bit better than when we last spoke about this, but that was from the middle of June. That's only going to last until the end of the first quarter of 2021. And I really don't think that the vaccine announcements are going to make any difference to what's going to be a really difficult first half of next year.
Yeah. I was also interested, Brian, that you said then you're anticipating a smaller industry. Does that mean fewer airlines? Does it mean airlines with smaller fleets? How do you see that playing out?
Well, we know it's going to be airlines, certainly airlines with a smaller fleet. We've seen, obviously mostly lots of cancellations of aircraft orders. We've seen airlines retiring their older fleet. So airlines are, there will be an environmental benefit to what's happening here in that a lot of the older coal burners are being pensioned out. So it'll be a more fuel efficient fleet. It'll be smaller. And I think we will see fewer airlines. At the moment, we've seen relatively few airline failures, certainly here in Europe. But in other regions, in Latin America, where the government support has not been forthcoming, you have seen some big airline failures, or at least restructuring under bankruptcy protection. And I think that is the future if governments step away, which they probably will at some point. So I think we will see, a more consolidated industry, which is, that's probably a good thing. There's plenty of airlines around to keep airline markets competitive. It's going to look a bit of a different industry once we come through that, and I think we're not coming through this for some time yet.
Right. Thanks, Brian. Adrian, turning to you for a moment and picking up on that last point, a smaller industry, fewer airlines, smaller fleets, and indeed I think fleets of smaller aircraft. What's the impact, do you think, for ATM of a smaller industry?
Well, we already see it now, Andrew, as you can see it. For the time being, we are exposed to less route charges as a result of less flights, but we also see shorter routes and lighter aircraft. Most of the European airlines have put aside for the time being, or maybe definitely, I don't know, that A380s, the 747s have been all retired. So we don't see that anymore in the system. And the system is based upon the flights, not about load factors. So we should not forget that when we still see a number of flights, on average we count for 10, 12,000 for this month a day, that's still aircraft with load factors below 50%. So the revenue generating capacity of the airlines has been dented incredibly. And now here comes the perversity of the system. Our system on which we base the charge to the airline is based upon the maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft. Why is that? In normal times, that's a good proxy for the revenue generating capacity of that flight. And at the same time, filling your aircraft is an environmental benefit as well. So that is all fine. But for the time being, it doesn't work anymore. We see already what happens for the time being. We do have a significantly reduced number of flights. We do have an ATM industry, which is based upon state responsibility, delegated to ANSPs, which run, they say, a business, which are corporatized or privatized sometimes. They say we run a normal business, but nevertheless, they run a monopoly, which is subject to economic regulation. On top of that, the route charges system is governed by the states. So we could have a hybrid situation where ANSPs, on the one hand, pretend to be businesses and develop like this. On the other hand, when it comes to risk sharing, they turn either unilaterally to the airspace users or to their government and say, you have to bail us out.
So they privatise the profits but socialise the losses.
Yeah, you could even ask the question, why should a specific service provider develop an activity of consultancy in Asia? A service provider has been given a sovereign task to ensure air traffic services in a given state, nothing more, nothing less. Stick to your business. And this is the point, I think I've made it in another session before. We lost the opportunity to consolidate. This would have been the ultimate moment to consolidate. We have run, and the state have run for good reasons, don't take me wrong, to save the ATM system and to make sure that the airlines could still fly. But nothing would have stopped them from in parallel starting to develop a movement which goes for consolidation.
Have we lost the opportunity? You don't think there's, let me re-ask that question. Do you think we are going to go back to business as usual?
No, we will not go back to business as usual because the driver of our business is aviation, is the airlines. And as we've heard from Brian, we will not go back to the normal. We will have a difference in the composition of fleet. We will probably see a new, but Brian is better placed, a new focus on how hub and spoke have to work. Does it have to work? We see for the moment that the transatlantic feeding is a difficulty for the airlines, and that's the profit maker in the European context. So it will never be business as usual. I don't see 747s coming back on the plane. And then we have to look at the way in which we distribute the cost, and then I come to the pricing argument and what we do with the risk sharing.
There's a lot to unpack in that, but let me start, if I could, with for an ANSP, and I speak here not as a controller, but for a controller, surely a blip is a blip, isn't it? I mean, why is the cost of delivering the service is irrelevant to the size of the airplane?
That is correct. But at the time, the choice was made to say the service given to the airline should be reflected in the cost through the revenue generating capacity of that flight. And you're absolutely right, and it's not only in air traffic control, it's counterintuitive, because bringing up an Avro RJ85 up to cruising speed takes much more controller time than, say, a 737neo. So there is something in contradiction, but it was supposed to be relevant for the value of the economic service provided to that aircraft.
So that brings us to a conversation about risk sharing as much as anything else, doesn't it? I mean, our current business model, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is effectively it costs €100 to control this sector. And if 100 aeroplanes go through it, we charge it €1 each. Correct. And if one aeroplane goes through it, we charge it €100. Yep. So already it's irrelevant to the size of the aeroplane, but directly to the work and irrelevant to the workload of the controller as well, of course. That strikes me as weird. Brian, does it strike you as weird as well?
Well, it certainly doesn't look like the way a normal business would operate in a competitive market. And I think, Adrian mentioned the risk sharing. In most businesses, risk is borne by those best able to deal with it, to manage it, and it produces completely crazy results. At the moment, the system is set up so that charges for airspace services will actually rise as your customers are disappearing. Now what competitive business would do that? Surely you cut your prices to get demand back into the market. We're a long way from a market in air traffic management services that is like a normal business. So I think either there's got to be change, and I hope we haven't missed the opportunity for consolidation. Obviously, one of the big problems at the moment in European airspace is the extraordinary fragmentation. We've got 60 odd en route control centers. The US has got 20. That is extremely inefficient. So I hope we haven't lost the opportunity to do that. So if we're going to get this sector to respond more to consumers and be more to the benefit of the wider economies, you've either got surely to make sure it's regulated better. And we've got a pretty toothless regulator at the moment, unfortunately, in the PRB, or we make it a bit more competitive. I mean, that might be challenging, certainly in upper airspace, but we've seen some signs in lower airspace at the airports with injecting a bit of competition. And we know from the experience of the airline sector following the liberalisation in the 90s, the enormous strides and the focus on what consumers want that you get from that.
Yes, indeed. And the other thing, SES2++, 2 to the power of infinity, also talks about data liberalisation to some extent, or creating a market for the data, which I think is interesting. Perhaps we'll get back to that in a moment. But Florian, I want to turn to you for a moment, if I can. I mean, the picture that Adrian and Brian have painted is of a fairly dysfunctional, fairly broken economic model for a fundamental part of the aviation industry. Is technology the answer? Does technology solve the fragmentation that Brian's talking about?
Good morning. Thank you, Andrew. Well, I mean, I must say I'm a bit selfish today in this discussion because I'm trying to figure out as well where the system is going through this crisis. And to answer your question, technology is not disconnected from the way investments are going to be made in the future. It's not disconnected from the business models that Brian was talking about. When SESAR was created, it was really to answer one question: can technology support change in the ATM domain, and how can it do it? And today we have the answer. The answer is a clear yes. We have demonstrated through SESAR that technology can bring a value in terms of modernizing the system, providing solutions, moving to different types of cooperation in terms of how the airspace is being managed. One illustration of that is what has been done through the airspace architecture studies that led to this notion of data service providers, which is a way to consolidate the data service layer on a kind of a very fragmented infrastructure that we have in Europe. But I think the bottom line is what will trigger the investments in the coming months. Will there be, first of all, enough money to continue to invest in modernizing the system? And to me, it is really unclear. I think we are at a turning point where we have part of the stakeholder who still believes that to a large extent this is a tough time to go through, but that in 6 months, maybe 1 year, we'll be back to a certain level of business as usual, and therefore we can expect somehow the same type of approach to technology as we've seen over the last decade. On the other hand, we do have a number of them who start to realize that there might be more change coming, and that the system as we know it today is maybe somehow broken, and that they will have to invest in a very different type of approach, very different type of technology to continue to deliver a sustainable business. So to me, it's really clear that technology will go hand in hand with the way the decision makers, investors will have to reshape their business, their services in the coming months.
Gosh, thank you. A lot there as well. We're going to talk modern monetary theory. We're going to talk investment. We're going to talk all sorts of things after that. I'm still want to probe a little bit, if I can, though, this bit about the fragmentation, because I wonder if fragmentation is the enemy of scalability. And scalability seems to be one of the things we're talking about here. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I think fragmentation is not helping. It's not helping anywhere. It was not helping when we had the capacity crisis about 1.5 years ago. It seems a long way ago, but it was just, I mean, if we would have had this conversation in November last year, we would be talking about how difficult the next summer session will be. But to a certain extent, this was forcing us at that point in time to move the traffic where the capacity was available instead of moving the capacity where we had the traffic demand. So you see that this scalability issue of the ability of the system to cope with more traffic or with less traffic, or cope with the relevant traffic where it is at the time where it is, is definitely connected to how we handle the European network. And if we have a fragmented approach regarding the way we provide the services, then obviously this makes things more complicated. And that's why the network operations are so important, and the role of the network manager is so important. But if I look fragmentation, there is fragmentation as well in our infrastructure. We have an infrastructure of CNS, communication, navigation, surveillance in Europe, which is extremely fragmented. We have overlaps in terms of radar coverage. We have no proper design of the radio communication network, which led to all the problem we had in the deployment of data link. So it's clear that wherever we have fragmentation, we are creating and generating more problems.
Yeah, but fragmentation in part, I think, what I was hoping we'd get to is a discussion perhaps about consolidation in there, because I'm really struck by Adrian saying we've missed the opportunity for consolidation. Brian saying there's still the chance of consolidation in the in the airline sector. And ANSP consolidation. Adrian, why do you think we've missed the boat? Why can't we do this now? Why? Let me put that question slightly differently. If we go down the SES2 plus sort of line of data being competitively provided, is that more fragmentation, or is that actually an opportunity for us to look at consolidation?
I think that it's a fair opportunity for more consolidation. At the moment, as long as we have got a regulation in place which imposes a standard treatment for all of them. And this is where I'm a bit...
Sorry, it does what? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
That the treatment of the data has been uniformized and harmonized at the pan-European level, because otherwise we do not bring anything. And I want to come back to something Florian said before about fragmentation. We have had a sort of informal analysis done in the busiest day of flight in 2018. And this is about the capacity crunch. On the busiest day of 2018, if the airspace could have been structured ignoring national borders, we would have had a 20% overcapacity still available on the busiest day, which was a day with huge delays. So the fragmentation is driving the cost. That can be clear. The cost of delay are huge, are maybe even more important than the cost of having a couple of extra ANSPs you do not need. So I think from that point of view, we need to look at it. And then always the question which I as a layman have, why don't we take the best performing system in Europe and make that a mandatory standard? So you can just plug in and that's it.
Could not agree more. Brian, why don't we take the best performing system in Europe and make that standard? And more importantly, why aren't the airlines demanding that's what we do?
Well, I think they want that to happen. You know, they want a better air service provision. We know that it was failing before this crisis with the disastrous performance of 2018 and only a marginal improvement in 2019. And it's not just the airlines; it's their customers. You know, there are big, wider economic consequences because of the delays from this. I mean, we did some work with a consultancy a few years back. If you removed those delays, the European economy could be some 230 billion larger. There could be an extra million jobs. So this is not just the airlines moaning about the service that they're getting. This has importance for European business. So we do want to see some improvements take place, Andrew.
I mean, but I think there are two or three things there. First of all, what I find remarkable is that the airlines moan so little about the service. They moan constantly about the cost. They don't moan dreadfully much about the value, which I think is a really interesting thing. And some of you may have heard me say this before. I mean, I suspect the reason why the airlines don't complain at the moment is that whilst the service is mediocre, it's mutually mediocre. So, nobody suffers more than anybody else. But I'd love to know when we get to a conversation about value instead of a conversation about cost from the airline side. I'd really love to know that. But secondly, the cost issue, the study you talk about talks about change, and perhaps it's actually the first point, I beg your pardon. The study you talked about simply assumed the current system but took away the delays. I'm paraphrasing it, but not by much, I don't think. What about a discussion about much more wholesale, much more substantial change? Why aren't we looking at a systemic change as opposed to just improvement?
Yeah. I mean, just to answer your first question, the reason that airlines talk about cost and price is because, unlike the provision of air navigation services, we are in a highly price-sensitive sector. If airlines charge more than their competitor, our customers will move. We have to be price and cost competitive.
But you also have to focus on value, don't you? I mean, it's the value you get.
True. I think the reason that there's not more push, at least from individual airlines, is because they've got a crisis to manage, and I think it's for forums like this, and perhaps for governments to see that we do need more fundamental change to take place. I mean, it's also that airlines don't really have much influence with a corporatized or basically a governmental body that provides the service. They can't. The airlines can't say, well, we don't like your service. We don't think you're giving value for money. We will go elsewhere.
Sorry, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. The airlines don't think they have very much influence over the way aviation is regulated. Can we have a quick talk, Brian, about the slot regulation waiver?
We can.
I mean, all I'm saying is that airlines have managed to get change when they want change in areas. I just find it fascinating that in this area, perhaps the want isn't deep enough yet. But let's not go down onto one of my favourite hobby horses, as tempting as that would be. Again, we've seen with the data proposal for data reform that we're in a place perhaps where ANSPs can operate more commercially. They can do the things that they need to do better than and not focus on things that they don't need to do. I mean, it's almost as if Adam Smith has finally entered the ATM arena. ATM as pin making. Is that how, I hate to bring economics into a discussion with economists, but is that how you see it?
Yes, I think there's value in specialization. That's where we get efficiency gains. That's where we get a better service. That would be great, and I certainly support that notion that we can to some degree unbundle some of these supporting services and have them provided by specialists, but by a competitive market, because the only way that you get the focus on the consumer is if you're worried that you're going to lose your business to your competitor. I guess that's the concern of the airlines with the whole unbundling notion, is that you're just going to create a private monopoly rather than a governmental one.
Right. Well, thank you. That's a really good point as well, though, of course, isn't it? The only thing worse than a public monopoly is a private one. There's no doubt about that. But Florian, turning back to you then, is there a technological solution to some of the problems that Brian's raising?
Well, maybe just to pick on the data services and on the CNS topic. Everything is very strongly connected, and I don't think we have drawn fully the lessons from the data link story, where basically we ended up with airlines paying for connectivity that they were not getting, except in a few parts of Europe. And what kind of system do we have whereby, we have the users who are paying for the service that they don't get, and it can continue like that for years and years and years. And I think this is what is at stake, really, to understand how we could move ahead with different solutions, because yes, there will be different solutions on the market to connect an aircraft, for instance, to an ANSP. And I think we have to demystify as well, to a certain extent, what air traffic control is. Air traffic control is primarily based on data. Once you are able to communicate to an aircraft to know its position and to know its intention, you can perform air traffic control services. And so the question is, in the future, what will be the technologies, for instance, that will enable to connect to an aircraft to get its intention? And we have the answer to that. We know that there will be different possibilities to connect an aircraft with another one as well as with the ground system. We have tested that in SESAR. We have tested ground technology as well as satellite-based technologies, for instance. But every time we are trying to push for implementing those technologies, we end up with the same story from the airlines. They're saying, okay, but we are already paying for this cost. Why would we pay for another provider to get connected or to send my aircraft trajectory to the ANSPs? And this is really what we have to crack if we want to progress. The good news is that those technologies, they are, well, a number of them quite scalable. They are, I would say, rather easy to deploy compared to the past technologies. And today, for instance, if I just look at the satellite segment, we have different initiatives that can demonstrate that you can properly connect an aircraft with the relevant level of performance that is required to perform air traffic control, which is another issue, by the way, because all our regulatory environment is based on technology, while it should be based on the performance that the service should achieve, to come back to your value discussion.
Indeed, we should be focusing on the service, not the product. Couldn't agree more. Adrian, that though, I mean, what Florian's just said brings us back, doesn't it, to almost some of the stuff we said early on in this conversation. To go forward, to get improvement, we're going to need to invest in change.
Yeah.
All investment takes is money.
Yeah, that's correct. And you can ask the question, if there is always a positive business case against the development in technology, then what should be the problem of getting that money out of the airlines? Because they will be the big benefiters of that. And then you only have to discuss maybe a pre-funding at, say, public money. But in the long run, it should be repaid by the airlines. They will argue they do so. But the 3 billion which have invested so far in SESAR has not come from the airlines and has not been shouldered onto the airline. So this is where I'm a bit ambiguous about how to deal with that best. Should we have done just that, let it go its course and say what I said before? We pick the best standard system available. We say that's the standard. We don't invest any more in R&D thereon. We buy the best flight management system, and we do that like this, and we stamp that. And then we say that is the standard, and the money we now plow into SESAR, we use to defray the social cost coming out of a consolidation, so to make sure that air traffic controllers can go home in a decent way. So, I mean, that's the question, and that's the question to be raised to the airlines if they want to put money there.
I'm sure you didn't mean that we can allow the air traffic controllers to go home in quite the way I visualised it, but Brian, so why not? Why not all this investment? Is it now the time to spend the money?
I think we need to be, airlines, in order to get passengers on seats, have cut fares perhaps 30% on domestic markets. Airlines are dramatically downsizing their costs to fit the smaller revenue flows that they've got. I think now is certainly not the time to increase costs. What we need to do is to downscale costs to make them economically viable. And I mean, I might take issue with a couple of the points. Because airlines have, through the modern aircraft that they've got, have spent huge amounts of money on the technologies. Data link was mentioned, but the ESB, the avionics in modern aircraft are capable of much better performance. And despite paying money to the ANSPs over the second regulatory period for investments in capacity and technology, to a large extent, that investment hasn't taken place. That money has gone to surpluses, it's been returned to governments, it hasn't. So airlines have already, paid for investments that haven't taken place.
You're absolutely right. Modern aircraft can fly wingtip to wingtip, very safely, but we still insist on miles and miles and miles of separation. We could up the capacity that way. Florian, Brian's got a very good point, hasn't he? The airlines have spent the money.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where's the investment?
I can't deny that. That's for sure. And to me, I will say one of the elements I want to highlight is that if I look at the situation we have in Europe today, we have the most equipped airlines which are paying for CNS infrastructure that they don't use, that we cannot decommission because of older aircraft. And not only that, they cannot use the technologies that they have paid for, like USB or data link. So we are constantly putting the incentives the other way around for the airlines to continue to invest and continue to pick up. And this is really what we have to crack. The other thing I wanted to highlight from that standpoint is that we have the debate here focused on the revenue and the financial aspects. I was attending a few weeks ago the Next Gen Advisory Committee in the US. Next Gen is the counterpart of the SESAR program. There, the discussion is completely different. I mean, the airlines don't look at the cost of the system at all because that's not on their shoulders. So they only look at the value that they're getting out of the system. And to me, it shows how I would say technology is connected to the economical environment and the regulatory environment we are acting in.
But in the US, the system is different, isn't it? I mean, in Europe, it's user pays.
Yeah.
I'm not an economist, but looking at our economists, as a general comment, I think economists think user pays is a better solution, don't they? Adrian, can I put that to you?
You can ask for the question mark there, because in the past, the user pays principle was chosen because at the moment in time, not everybody was flying. Flying was considered to be a sort of elite type of transportation. So it was only reasonable to have those people using that means of transport pay for that. In the meantime, I would argue that society at large, no exceptions there, benefits from aviation. If it's not because they take an aircraft themselves, then it's because their medicines are delivered to them by cargo. So everybody benefits. Is that maybe a way of saying, okay, and I don't want to take the word renationalization in the mouth, but to make the taxpayer pay for the availability of capacity of safe transportation in the air. Is that maybe an option? That should not hamper us from consolidating. I would argue even the pressure would be higher on consolidating, because if governments are exposed to being forced, again, to put the cost of ATM on their fiscal accounts, then I think there will be a huge drive from the Ministries of Finance to speak with the neighbors and say, listen, can we not find a solution on this one?
Yeah, countries speaking to each other peacefully is a very common thing that we see all the time. No, wait. Brian, do you support Adrian in that? We seem to have moved from a situation where we were talking about consolidation to a situation where we're talking about renationalisation. Renationalisation of already state-owned entities, I might add. But what's your view on that?
I do. I think, and unfortunately, I think you might see this in the airline sector as well. But I think it's, user pays, go back to what you were saying, user pays is certainly a good principle, but it's all about getting the incentives right. And at the moment, the incentive structure in the NSP world just doesn't seem right. It's not focused on the consumer or the user. I mean, I guess the argument for nationalisation would be that at least governments might be concerned about the impact of inefficiency on the wider economy, and so they would drive the improvements through. But the alternative, of course, would be to really strengthen the regulator, make sure that we've got an independent regulator that's driving things, in the absence of any sort of competition apart from at the edges of the industry.
A stronger, better regulator, which would also, of course, need to be funded. That's one of the great mysteries, that everyone wants a regulator, no one wants to pay for it. Yeah. Sorry, Adrian, yeah.
I want to ask Brian a question, and that's one which triggers my mind for a long time already. So if you buy a ticket, you get a nice bill sent home, and it says airport taxes, charges, and so on. Why don't airlines make explicit on the bill the cost of a safe provision by ATM? And says that's on average it will be between 7 and 8 euros on the ticket. Why don't you get the audience on your side?
Well, that's a good point, Adrian. I think getting the audience on the right side is probably a good thing. But that ticket and tax box on your old ticket, the old, is a bit of an anachronism. Airlines have to set the total price depending on what the consumer will pay.
Sure.
It's a very different world. It's not. We can't recover all our costs. Certainly, that's what's happening at the moment. Unlike the system that we have for financing the ANSPs at the moment, which is that they can cover all their costs, and it doesn't create the right incentives for innovation, adopting technology, focusing on customers.
So, Brian, what is the right incentive?
The incentives has surely got to be to provide something that your customer wants. Whereas at the moment, I fear, with the underinvestment that's taken place, which I thought was inexplicable, but surely it must be because some of the corporatized bodies are more concerned with pleasing their government owners than the users. We need a system that is focusing on producing the performance that users and the wider economy needs.
Adrian, what do you think is the right incentive? The right incentive for the ANSPs to invest is if there is we need Florian for that. You can only invest in something which has a stamp on it, that it has a proven cost-benefit analysis and which is supported by the airlines. If you do that, then the future investment will always be SESAR-proof, to put it like this. And in that case, that's the only way you're allowed to put it into your cost base. Otherwise, you can invest in it, that's fine, you can do it, as long as you don't put it into your cost base.
Florian, what do you say to that?
My view on that is that, again, I'm coming back to the example of data links that I was mentioning, whereby we ended up basically financing through EU funds the last movers. For me, this was a typical example of the opposite of what we should be doing. And that's something we really advocated in the airspace architecture study, which is to say, let's incentivize the early movers, the ones who are investing and using technologies that are somehow ahead of the game. They need to find an incentive in the system. And to me, this is absolutely necessary if we want to accelerate the pace of technology upgrade. And in my view is that we should have an approach whereby we keep everybody at a minimum level so that we move somehow the bottom to a certain extent in a coherent manner in terms of technology upgrade. But at the same time, we cannot afford to move everybody at the same pace because this pace is the slowest mover usually in Europe. So we have as well, at the same time as we keep this level, let's say, moving upward all at the same time, we need to incentivize the ones that are up there, that wants to go fast, that are taking decisions to invest in those technology like virtual technologies for remote towers, for instance, or for more advanced automation levels in their ops room and so on. Because only by doing that we will encourage the others to follow. And I think this is as well a bit the spirit that has been developed in the SES2+ to create this type of momentum. Because what we see is across Europe very different approach to technology. And we do have ANSPs who are ahead of the game, who have invested a lot in using the technology. But we have always, of course, as well, others who are much, much slower. And we cannot afford just to go at this slow pace.
Thank you. Brian, Florian makes a good point, doesn't he? And it's sort of almost nearly the point you made before. The airlines have already invested in really advanced technology in their airframes and aren't getting the benefit of that. There are ANSPs that are making more focused, perhaps better outcome-driven investments than others. How on earth do we reward those two groups of good citizens? Airlines with good airframes and ANSPs with good technologies. How do we do this? How do we make this work?
Well, in a competitive market, it would be easy because they would get all the customers.
Right. Yeah. So we're back to consolidation.
We are, and in the absence of moving towards a more competitive market, it's getting an efficient regulator, an independent regulator as well.
Adrian, what's your view? How do we get to this place?
Well, we have to dwell for 1 minute very briefly on the regulator. We have now established a system which has a very complicated and all-encompassing performance review system. I deliberately use the word system here. Well, what I do not understand is why we can't go for a union-wide target which is translated into local targets, because speaking with the Estonian service provider who provides the same service for 33 euros, whereas you go to another one who asks 90 euros for basically the same service, albeit in a different airspace and with a different cost structure, then you have to ask yourself, why don't you not translate it in such a way that you give the task to the external auditors, they take off the box, this is your environmental capacity, this is your environmental target, this is your cost target, and this is your horizontal flight efficiency target. And you pick it off. You don't need a huge and difficult system. And the current performance regulation system is hampering. If we were to print out all the reporting tables, we come onto 1,200 pages, if I remember correctly, once calculated. Nobody will read that. Nobody can assess that. So we need to simplify the way in which we provide the incentive and in which we deal with the performance of the ASPs.
Right. And so, Florian, last word to you, because we are out of time. Is the answer technology to try to address some of these issues?
Technology is part of the answer, but that's not the only answer. I think if we get back to technology, and if I look a bit ahead, what we have to reflect upon is to keep investing in the modernization, because there's no other way. And it doesn't mean that we have to do research forever. It means that we have to start investing concretely in the solutions that have been developed. The second thing is we need to invest in the right technology, and we know for sure now what are the technologies that are the ones that are going to deliver performance in the future. And the last thing is that we have to invest in the right way. And for that, we have to avoid fragmentation. We have to invest in a coordinated manner, in a way that as well keeps Europe's potential towards other regions when it comes to space technology, when it comes to this type of things which do make sense only at continental level and not at each and individual member state level.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm sure you join me in thanking Brian and Adrian as well as Florian for this amazing conversation. There's a very famous joke about economists that if you put an economist in a room with two windows, he'll come out with three views. But I think it's fair to say that we've certainly canvassed the issue of consolidation and how important that might be. And importantly, I think we've also talked about incentives, which then leads on to how we structure our regulation in the absence of, or perhaps until we get to, he said optimistically, some sort of competitive market or more competitive market, and also looking at addressing some of that fragmentation and how we build sustainability by getting rid of some of that fragmentation. It's been a complicated conversation at some levels, but it's been an absolutely fascinating one. And just before we go, I'd like to remind you that we are back again next week, same time next week, for our final webinar in this series. And this time we'll be talking about what the future might look like from a much more technological perspective with Patrick Key, the Executive Director of EASA, Grazia Vittadini, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Airbus. So that combination of the airframe and how we put it all together. And of course, Florian will join us as well. So until then, I wish you a very good day and thank you very much for your company. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.